I also want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about my latest book, The Road to Freedom, Economics in the Good Society. It might seem strange for an economist to be talking about freedom, but actually discussions of freedom and liberty and the relationship to the economic system have been part of the economics agenda, and these issues have moved up front and center, partly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, partly because we've just been through the pandemic, and many on the right resisted mask and vaccination requirements, and they did so because they said it was an infringement on their liberty. More generally, there's been a growth of libertarianism, especially in the United States, and especially in the West Coast among people like Musk, who talk about libertarianism, even though Tesla only survived because the government gave it $500 million. He forgets about that as he talks about government shouldn't be doing anything. But there is a widespread lack of trust in government and collective action more generally, and I want to push back against that. As I said, economists have long been engaged in debates about freedom and its relationship to the economic system. For instance, in the middle of the 19th century, one of the most famous economists was John Stuart Mill, and he wrote a book called On Liberty. In the middle of the last century, Milton Friedman, the apostle of neoliberalism, wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom. And many of you may have noticed that the title of my book, The Road to Freedom, is actually a riff off of Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. Hayek had written this book in 1944, just after the Great Depression, as the role of government was being increased. Markets have failed to maintain macroeconomic stability. In the Great Depression, 1 out of every 4 people were unemployed. It was clear the market was not working, and there was a demand for government to take a greater role. At the same time, in Scandinavia, there was an increased role for government in social protection. And even in the UK, where Hayek taught at the LSE, it would be only a couple years before the UK government adopted the national health insurance, which has become a major treasure for the British people. He was worried, Hayek was worried, that this increased role of government would lead to economic and political subservience, and so he thought it would lead to what he called serfdom. In fact, he was 180 degrees wrong. What you see around the world is the growth of authoritarian populism that Trump, in Brazil, Bolsonaro. You see that in countries where government hasn't done enough. You don't see as much of that kind of authoritarian populism in countries like in Scandinavia, where governments have actually tried to address the real concerns of the people. So the point I'm trying to raise is economists have often written about the subject, so I feel safe as an economist entering into this territory. The claim of Hayek and Friedman was that free markets and free enterprise, and I put those in quotes explicitly, were the best way to promote economic well-being and individual freedom. They argued furthermore that there were moral justifications behind market-driven distribution, including the market-driven inequalities. And that was called the theory of just desserts. And they thought everybody would eventually benefit anyway through a theory of trickle-down economics. And they also argued that free markets were essential for maintaining political freedom. Each of these claims, I argue in my book, is suspect. I point out that the terms like free markets and free enterprise are used deliberately to bias the discussion. And I'll explain why that is. Advances in economic theory and experiences with neoliberalism over the past 40 years, it's been a more than 4-decade experiment, have exposed the limitations in these earlier analyses and suggest an alternative economic framework that I'll call progressive capitalism, but sometimes people can think of it as a humanitarian economic system, does better in enhancing individual freedom and political freedom, and more broadly, societal well-being. So underlying my book was the belief that it was important for progressives to reclaim the freedom agenda. And I'm very pleased, of those of you who have been following the American election, that Harris has actually adopted this language in much of her campaign. So this is the outline of my talk. It's a little bit ambitious, and I'll probably have to go faster than I should. But let me just begin with a discussion of the broad economic perspective. And some of these ideas, the Prime Minister outlined very briefly yesterday, preempting my necessity to talk about all of these ideas. The first is that liberty is how do we think about freedom and liberty? It's about a person's freedom to act. Somebody at the point of starvation has no real freedom. He does what he has to do to survive. And as we expand what an individual can do, we effectively expand his freedom. So in technical terms, economists would say an expansion of his opportunity set is an expansion of his freedom, and any reduction in what he can do is a reduction in his freedom. The second very important idea is that for any society to function, there must be regulation and collective action. We don't live in isolation. You know, there's a famous poem by Donne called "No Man is an Island," and we live in a society. We are social beings, and that means we have to have some form of regulation. In fact, if you think about the oldest religions, you know, the Ten Commandments were a simple set of regulations. We don't think of it that way, but it's a regulation. Thou shalt not steal. That's a regulation. Thou shalt not kill. That's another regulation. And if you look through the Ten Commandments, they are a set of regulations. But they were very simple. And that was a simple society. We live in a complex, urbanized society where we are constantly interacting, and that means we need more regulations. And this is where one of the key ideas of the book is one person's freedom can be another person's unfreedom. Or as Isaiah Berlin pointed out and was mentioned both in the introduction of my talk and the Prime Minister's remarks yesterday, Isaiah Berlin put it more poetically that freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. I'll talk about a lot of examples of that. Economists use a less poetic term. They say these are externalities, where one person's actions affect the well-being of another, and they can be both negative and positive. So when we think about a society where people are interacting with each other, we recognize that there can be conflicts of freedoms. For instance, there's a number of very peculiar debates in the United States that people in other countries don't understand, but let me put them forward in any case. One of them is people in the United States on the right say everybody should have the right to carry not only a gun, but an AK-47. But when you think about what happens in the United States as a result of that, is that every day almost there is a mass murder. And our president, Franklin Roosevelt, talked importantly about freedom from fear. And the freedom to carry a gun has meant that when kids go into school, they don't know whether they're going to come out. And their parents worry. There's a fear. And in fact, children 5, 6 years old in kindergarten are trained in the United States what to do when a gunman comes in. So every class begins with at the beginning of the year about training for what happens if somebody comes into your class with AK-47. That gives you fear. And so the freedom to carry a gun has meant, and an AK-47 has meant a loss of freedom to live and a loss of freedom from fear. The same thing can be said about the right not to get vaccinated that I mentioned in the very beginning, or the right to wear a mask. Not wearing that threatens others' right not to get the disease, not to be hospitalized, even their right to live. And the same thing goes for pollution. The right to pollute, the freedom to pollute, threatens others' rights to live a healthy life, and all over the world with climate change. In each of these cases, society has to make a judgment. People like Trump say the right to pollute and kill other people is more important than the right to live. I think he's wrong. And I think most reasonable societies, when they have a discussion of that, will agree with me and not with Donald Trump. So those are the easy cases. There are some cases that are more difficult, and I'll mention later on, different societies in the more difficult cases may come up with different answers. But it's important that there be a societal discussion of the nature of those trade-offs. There are, these kinds of trade-offs are pervasive, and they include issues about distribution. For instance, libertarians and conservatives argue that taxation is a deprivation of liberty of the right to spend one's money as one pleases. The claim is that taxation is coercion, even when there is some form of representation. Taxation, admittedly does constrict the individual's budget constraining what he can do, his opportunity set. But at the same time, the revenues from that expand the opportunities of others. When those revenues come in and get redistributed to the poor, they expand the opportunity set of others. In a society with a fixed amount of resources, expanding one individual's budget constraint, enhancing his freedom to spend, necessarily entails constraining others. Of course, there are some cases where we can expand the whole pie, but I'm focusing here on those cases where there's just a limited amount of resources. But expanding the opportunities by providing health and education to the poor can expand the opportunity sets far more than it contracts the set of those being taxed, enabling them to more nearly live up to their potential. So that's the sense in which, again, policies of inclusive growth may entail some trade-offs, but the expansion of the opportunity set, the freedom of some of the poor, is so much more important than the slight contraction of those at the top. Moreover, one of the broader points that I raised in one of my earlier books, The Price of Inequality, is that actually societies with more equality actually perform better. We pay a very high price in our societies for the extremes of inequality that we have. I now want to talk about a slightly different idea, a second major theme of the book, which is a little bit a conundrum. It sounds strange, and that is some coercion can actually be freeing. You know, it sounds inconsistent. How can coercion be freeing? And the way to see that is to begin with a simple example in a crowded city like New York. Take the idea of stoplights, traffic lights. Cities couldn't function without traffic lights. The traffic lights are a regulation. They're a constraint. You say you can't go until you get a green light. So they constrain what we can do. But think of what would happen in New York if we didn't have stoplights. We would have gridlock at every intersection, and nobody could move. So the idea of a simple regulation can actually be freeing for everybody. In the absence of them, nobody can move. A stoplight, a simple regulation, allows everybody to move, but taking turns. So we call that a coordination failure, and collective action solves that particular coordination failure. But this example is actually a metaphor for a wide class of areas where collective action is important. We wouldn't be here having this kind of discussion that we're having today if it hadn't been for the vaccines, in particular the mRNA vaccines. We wouldn't have those vaccines if we hadn't done research at universities like University of Pennsylvania, where they developed the platform, the mRNA platform, and then the government gave a little bit more money to translate that general platform into a vaccine against COVID-19. Well, if you're going to have that kind of public research, basic research, which is always going to be publicly provided, you have to have taxation. So that coercion of taxation, forcing people to pay for a public good, the development of a vaccine, has made us all free. So a little coercion, saying you have to pay taxes, and that tax revenue is used, in this case, for the provision of public good, has expanded all of our freedoms. So that's the sense in which coercion can actually enhance freedom. Now, there are obviously some instances where coordination, this kind of regulation, can be sustained with little or no coercion and with enormous benefits. One example is which side of the road you drive on. In some countries, there hasn't been a coordination, and driving is dangerous. if some are driving on the left and some are driving on the right, you're going to get accidents. And a simple rule, some countries they've decided on the left, some countries they've decided on the right. There's no a priori reason one is better than the other, but you need a coordination mechanism, and you need a simple rule that enables that solution of that simple problem. And of course, once the rules are set and everybody understands them, they're easy to sustain. Once we think about things in the way I've just described, very natural to go on from that notion to an understanding of the trade-off, the conflict between exploitation and freedom. And underregulated markets are marked by exploitation, even when there is a high level of competition, but even more so when competition is limited. There's exploitation of market power, exploitation of the vulnerable and imperfectly informed. There are two ways to make profits in a market economy. One, to produce better goods. That's what Adam Smith and the people on the right talk about. But the other one is to take advantage of your market power, which is what companies like Google do, or to take advantage of those who are less informed. A paradigm of that is Trump University. There were many people who aspired to be rich. It was simply designed to exploit them, provide them no education, and in the end, many of you may know, they sued and said, you promised us something and you gave us nothing, and Trump had to pay millions of dollars in compensation. But if we didn't have laws, that kind of exploitation would be rampant in our society. And that simple point that exploitation is a way of increasing profits undermines the claims of the efficiency of unfettered markets. Again, there's a trade-off. You can say the right of corporations to exploit versus the right of others not to be exploited. And the exploitation of market power obviously constrains consumers' opportunity sets because it raises prices. That's another example, though, where if we have a societal discussion of this, I think that's an easy decision. Which is more important? The right of corporations to exploit our environment, to exploit the vulnerable, to exploit market power, versus the right of those who are being exploited. And clear, in that case, how we would make the judgment. There's a broad consensus that that kind of exploitation should be constrained, in spite of the loss of the liberty by the monopolists. And we could justify that both on moral and efficiency grounds. And this is particularly evident in the extreme cases where the monopolist has control over something which is necessary for life itself. Now, modern behavioral economics has introduced us to ideas about there are non-coercive ways of altering behavior and less intrusive than regulations. But I won't have time to talk about those. I want to go on and talk about one issue, though, that I think is very important, and that has to do with the media. Our behavior is affected by what we know, information we have. And if perceptions, beliefs, and preferences can be altered by the media, then society faces an important set of decisions. Who gets to control the press and gets to control, or at least shape, societal meta-narratives, stories about how society functions? and the consequence of loss of freedom on the part of others. Should it be based on wealth, enabling the wealthy to advance through economics and politics their interests, further constraining the freedom and choices of others? What regulations should be imposed on the media, including the social media, to prevent or at least reduce these social harms? This has become one of the major issues facing countries all over the world. And unfortunately, the discussion on this is being driven to a large extent by the social media companies, arguing that they should not be regulated and that they should have the power to shape what we know and disseminate mis and disinformation. A major theme of my book is talking about what we would mean by a good society, and I suspect that constructing the good society would entail more regulations and less ability of the wealthy to dominate in the shaping of beliefs and preferences. In writing my book, one of the things that influenced me a great deal were these key ideas that we call the Enlightenment that occurred in the middle and end of the 18th century. Adam Smith was part of that Enlightenment. And a key idea in the Enlightenment was the notion of tolerance. Central in earlier perspectives was that one's views, beliefs about what is desirable or good should have no bearing on what is allowed, encouraged, or discouraged. Only actions should matter. But the right, at least in the United States, are repudiating such notions of Enlightenment tolerance as they have walked away from other Enlightenment values. Now, I want to come now to the second part of my talk, where very briefly I'm going to talk about the relationship between neoliberal capitalism and freedom. In some ways, the very term neoliberal raises the notion of freedom, because liberal represented not freedom. Neo was new. But of course, there was nothing new about neoliberalism. It was just that old liberalism didn't sound as good as neoliberalism. So that's why it's called neoliberalism. And it should be clear by now that when I think of neoliberalism, it was freeing the wolves so they could eat the sheep. It was freeing the corporations to do what they would to take advantage of consumers. It was giving them market power to take away income and increase inequality. So here the idea is that Friedman and Hayek's views that capitalism enhanced individual freedom were flawed, both because their analysis of individual liberty in an interdependent society was flawed, and their understanding of economics was even more flawed. Now, you might say, this is a little bit, for me to be saying that two Nobel Prize winners in economics didn't understand economics is a little arrogant. It is, but they didn't understand economics. And what can I say? Their view was that unfettered markets were efficient, and my own research showed that unfettered markets are not competitive, not stable, not efficient. Maximizing shareholder value does not maximize societal well-being. They underestimated or ignored a host of market failures. And importantly, the underlying model of the individual with well-defined, fixed preferences, rational, infinitely rational, perfectly selfish, perfectly well-informed individual, that model of the individual was fundamentally flawed. Friedman, who's often called the apostle of free markets, claimed they were efficient and enhanced freedom. For example, in his book with his wife, Rose, his book was called Free to Choose. But as I mentioned in the very beginning, those with limited income are not free to choose. They do what they can to survive. And I've argued a better title for his book, Free to Choose, should have been called Free to Exploit. And let me say, I don't. It's just a Q&A time. Okay, let me go very quickly. Then I thought that was all my time, and I didn't realize. Okay, so Hayek's evolutionary theory was equally flawed. There's no teleology in evolution, and importantly, neoliberal capitalism may not even be in a sustainable institutional arrangement because it creates values like people become greedy, dishonest, really selfish, and those characteristics undermine the functioning of the market economy. What makes a market economy be viable is a certain amount of trust. Trust in each other, trust in institutions, and the product of extreme neoliberalism is Donald Trump. Somebody who nobody could trust. And every transaction would wind up in court, which is what actually happens. So it's not even a sustainable institution. So the critical question is, what kind of society is most likely to enhance the freedom of most citizens? And what I argue in the book is that the extremes of inequality, dissatisfaction with the way the market economy is working have put us on the road to fascism. And that what we need is an alternative economic system to put us on the road to freedom. And that alternative economic system I refer to as progressive capitalism. It entails decentralization, a rich ecology of institutional arrangements, not just collective action, as well as private enterprises, but also includes NGOs, civil society, cooperatives. And a key idea here is that the kinds of institutions that we have, the way we organize our economy, affects who we are. It shapes who we are. If you work in a cooperative institution, you're likely to wind up more cooperative. If you think about how each of your actions affects society more generally, you'll wind up more other regarding, caring about others. If you work in a care sector and you're told you should be maximizing profits, you behave differently than if you're told you're in a care economy, you're caring about elderly, you're caring about children, you're caring about the sick, and that's part of what your job is, to care about others. You act differently than you would be, and you become a different person than if you're a hedge fund thinking about how I can exploit these old elderly or these children. So it actually changes who we are. And I believe that this kind of progressive capitalism can create both greater freedom and greater efficiency and more equity. And as I said, shape individuals in a different way. And central in all this is the role of a liberal education to free you. This may be self-serving because I'm engaged in liberal education, but I do think it has a very important role to play in our society. I think these ideas have universal application. They apply as much to a developing country as a developed, to Malaysia as much as the United States. The answers to the trade-offs may be different in different societies depending on their history. So I don't want to say that the answers will be the same, but the way of thinking, the trade-off, that there exist these trade-offs, that there exists collective action that can make everybody better off is general. And these ideas have global implications. There's a strong parallel with issues of and implications for national sovereignty, but because of the lack of time, I won't talk about it. Maybe it'll come up in the question and answer period. But let me just conclude with saying, with greater investments, including in public goods and individuals' capabilities, better management of negative externalities, better advancement of activities with positive externalities, better social insurance, and stronger social cohesion, progressive capitalism can enhance individual freedom far more than the kind of unfettered capitalism that Hayek and Friedman advocated. It can do a better job of creating the good society, setting us more firmly on the road to freedom. And in this, government and civil society have critical roles to play in creating this good society. These ideas are as applicable to Malaysia as they are to the US or any other country and society. Thank you very much.